Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. It's pretty cold outside and it's rainy, so I have my mic inside my hoodie, which is certain to make a little bit of noise. I apologize in advance. Obviously, I can't detect it while I'm making the recording, and there's not a whole bunch I can do about it after the recording. But hopefully it won't be too bad, and it'll be uncommon. It's actually a beautiful day, even though it's cold and rainy. Of course, what's beautiful, or what has any quality at all, depends kind of on how we're in relation with it. And the purposes, some of which will always be unconscious, but others of which will be conscious or intentionally held purposes. And qualities depend for their emergence into awareness. First on, I think, relation, but for thinking animals like us, or animals capable of thought, purpose, history, narrative, what we're thinking, the stories we've been told and tell ourselves, these all have a profoundly determinative effect on the qualities that we experience and think about. Now, of course, this is a complex situation, and it's one of gradients or degrees, in that obviously, no matter what we're thinking, there's a degree where the quality we might derive is fairly concrete. If I put my hand in water, for example, or if I touch something very hot. And yet, the quality of hotness is more or less a cognitive quality, because if I were to touch something very hot, what I would experience first would just be pain. And even pain, it turns out, though again, it's a matter of degree, is not a quality or experience that can exist without someone experiencing what the word points toward. But what the word points toward is never one thing. And this is one of the peculiar, actually bizarre traps that we fall into with language. Pain will always refer to a vast constellation of things. Many of them are unknown. Some might be unknowable. And any actual pain will be uniquely experienced. And the experiencer themselves may or may not say that something is painful. They may or may not choose that particular way of referring to the experience that they're having. And of course, all things are relative. If one is in a lot of pain and suddenly one is in a lot less pain, that would be a great relief. Similarly, hot is relative to the context. If the context is 1,000,000 degrees, then 1,000 degrees, which would normatively for us seem to be extremely hot, is really mild, maybe even cool. So these qualities and the language that we use to refer to them are very deceptive if we look more deeply into the experience of living beings. And the way that we think of and apply qualities is so primitive for most of us, most of the time, that we're almost always wrong. In the sense of, if we took a broad and intelligent sampling of a phenomenon and we looked at it from many different perspectives rather than just one, we would see that the one commonly on offer is at best confused and often wrong because it presumes singleness or absoluteness. Many of our most foundational concepts and ideas are like this. They present as a one-pointed, one-dimensional, concrete thing. And there is no instance of that existing anywhere in reality. It's an idea. It's a concept. In other words, it's a cognitive perspective. And that can have emotional aspects and embodied aspects. But we are a very unique animal, because whether or not other animals are representationally sentient, and it appears that some of them express capabilities that imply they are, they're not in the same way we are. I'm sure there'd be some crossover. But for us, a universe of verbal and conceptual fictions is in direct competition with our felt senses, our essence, our organs, our body, our soma, and perhaps our souls. But this is the direction I'm pointing when I use the word essence. And so we live in this really strangely stratified conflict where on the upper level, so to speak, at least while we're awake, we have this historically developed and conserved array of biases, suppositions, beliefs, language, concepts, models, theories, proofs, traditions. A good example would be mankind is here to conquer nature. We have to conquer things, right? Or we are the most advanced animal on the planet. Well, you could find a domain in which that's true, but you could find 1,000 where it isn't. Or is even the opposite of the truth. So we have myths, right? And many of them have to do with what's natural or normal. But most of these myths and traditions and ideas and concepts, they're the produce of the aspect of our being that is more or less disembodied and might actually prefer to be entirely disembodied. Hence our technological fascination with what we refer to, I think very confusedly, as artificial intelligence. Completely disembodied, cognitive-like processes. And then we think, oh, well, let's bring them back into, let's just keep rolling it over, right? We'll bring the AIs into the body so that now they're partly embodied, disembodied processes. And that's something like what's happened with our cognition and our relationships with language and knowledge over time. So we're a really complex, strange animal. We've developed a very powerful imaginal array of prostheses, tools, devices. And they are astonishing in their capacity to endow us with the ability to manipulate force, context, the environment, mass, space, light, electromagnetic forces. Right? And we've certainly accomplished seemingly astonishing but incredibly dangerous things with the results of having developed this way. But underneath the vast stratifications of our inherited cognitive and technological histories and traditions and myths, there's an ocean, or oceans within oceans, of unimaginably ancient intelligence and sophistication. The origins of the unimaginable complexity of our bodies, even if measured only over a millionth of a second. I would argue that there's more intelligence in that activity over a millionth of a second in our bodies than there is in the entire cognitive and representational history of our species, including all of our computation. Underneath the strata, the organism we are, the human beings we are, the essence of our being, whatever that may be or not be. These things are suffering the impositions of formal representational cognition on our minds and world. Now, of course, we don't have to live in this kind of conflict. We inherit it. And the fact that we're capable of advanced representational cognition doesn't mean that the shadows of those assets must dominate our lives or hearts or world or bodies. Yet for the moment, they mostly do. Our hearts and minds and bodies live and are capable of expression primarily under the domination of the stratified layers of inherited cognitive activity and myths and imperatives and so on. And for, I think, nearly all of us, that's a relatively suffocating situation. It would be as if the tip of my pinky dominated my entire body, and the tip of my pinky was really interested in getting rid of the rest of that stuff. It's astonishing how modest, in comparison, the relatively tiny advancements of our cognitive and representational nature are in comparison to the staggering brilliance that our bodies and minds and perhaps our souls are living expressions of, moment to moment. And it turns out that the way we're in relation with that strata, the structured ideas and language and concepts, is really badly broken. And it's broken in such a way that the assets that comprise those traditions and behaviors are actually themselves suffering. They're suffering from loss of contact with their own origins. They're suffering from the felt necessity to dominate and dismiss our essence, our organismal nature, our animal nature, our human nature, and even our social nature. So it's as if an angry and confused teenager got a hold of all of the family assets and was willing to expend all of them in a bid to dominate their future. Maybe even expend its own life, right? It's not clear that the strange game we're engaged in isn't self-terminating. It looks like it is. The disembodied aspects that result in our technologies, war, our societies, and that are embodied in them are not there to succeed. They're there to continue the process of their development, survival, authorization, domination, and quote-unquote success. But that success doesn't mean to succeed at what they were forged for. It means to succeed at growing and dominating more terrain, acquiring more power, assets, resources, attention, and so on. So that means that our institutions, much like goodly portions of our cognitive and representational inheritance, are effectively malignant. And so it's no mystery why they don't work the way they're supposed to, quote unquote, or the way we imagine they should be proceeding, the way we imagine they should be capable of solving or responding to problems. They actually only use the minimal amount of that capacity required for them to survive, to reproduce, and to gain what you might think of as a good position in the market of things the humans will sustain and support and buy into. So it's a bit like we're being ridden by a swarm of different kinds of demons, right? They arise pretending to heroism. Once established, they primarily pursue the goals of domination, success, subterfuge, right? Hiding that fact. And you can see this in all of our institutions, our medical institutions, our government, scientific institutions, our academia, social institutions. They tend to work just barely good enough. Meanwhile, they're proliferating wildly and absorbing vast quantities of commodities and resources and living beings, living places, the organs of life and intelligence on our world. A troubling situation. Less troubling if we're not aware of some of the foundations of it. And I think they relate very deeply to the schism that has arisen between our nature as representational cognitive animals and our nature as animals, organisms, and beings in general. When I began this talk today, I was thinking about a peculiar problem with categories and qualities. I was thinking about the way that when a quality such as "this is warm" transforms to "this is cold," the heat is not gone. Rather, it seems, the domain of its expression has changed from highly local, as in a candle flame, to vastly distributed, and thus invisible. Now, the heat from the candle flame does really strange things in the environment, of course, depending on how the environment is, depending on the context. But even in a still room, the heat from the candle, though no longer brightly generated by its flame once it is extinguished, is all throughout the room. And if the candle is not completely consumed, then the heat is in the potential within the candle. Now, both of those, the distribution in the room and the potential in the candle, are invisible to us. We might be able to calculate them using what we've learned of physics and math. We might even be able to simulate what happens with the heat in the room, the heat from the candle when we extinguish it. But we can't know the actual state of these phenomena because its complexity is far greater than any capacity we have to analyze it. And it's vastly more significant than anything that can easily be framed in language. In other words, language and theory cannot fully encompass it. Language and theory are incomplete. If we shrink the context, language and theory begin to look more complete as we narrow the context. And this is part of how scientific research proceeds. We try to exclude as much of everything as we can get away with, and then we can more concretely distinguish elements we wish to observe, analyze, transform, and so on. But almost everywhere, we first have to get rid of most of what's going on, And often, especially in biology, this involves killing what we're trying to observe. And you can see here the hallmark of the problem. In the desire to measure, analyze, quantify, we're taking away some kind of heat is being, or energy is being transformed into another form. And in this case, it's a kind of a skeletal thing. It's the dead remains of what we originally intended to analyze in order to acquire mechanical understanding of properties familiar to us, properties we've set out to distinguish, highlight, prioritize, and measure. So I was thinking about how when someone or something disappears from somewhere, they don't actually go into nothing. They appear somewhere else, or transformations of their previous state appear somewhere else. And I was thinking in terms of, we can look at this in a very simple way. Think about the sun. The sun's blatantly obvious to all of us. Even those who don't have eyes can feel their heat. It's heat. And when the sun, quote unquote, goes away in the evening, it necessarily appears, light rises somewhere else. And instead of it being like an on-off switch, it's a continuum. Right? First, there's a very small degree of light. Dawn begins. The first glimmers of the rising of the sun. And strangely, with this particular example, it's both a gradient and a continuum. The sun disappearing here happens over a relatively slow amount of time, though it can be very surprising how quickly it grows dark once the sun actually gets near the horizon or sets. So the disappearance of the light from my locality is the appearance of the light in another locality. And this is the thing I'm trying to explore about qualities and transformations. Because our thinking, the way we're trained to think, the way we are habitually taught to relate with language and concepts like qualities, it tends to be very crude. It tends to be bipolar, single-pointed, monodimensional. That is a tree, right? That is cold, that is hot, that is bright, that is dark, that is beautiful, that is ugly. Yet none of these qualities are really intrinsic to any phenomenon that I understand. Because for them to emerge to comment or awareness, there must be a mind. And the mind has to be somehow engaged with phenomenon. Yes, the sheet of paper looks white, but is that true? Without my mind, the sheet of paper has no look. In fact, there is no sheet of paper. So it's just important to understand that qualities arise as a result of relation with embodied animals, living places, senses, beings, and also with our peculiar cognitive nature and its priorities. And one of the things I was pointing out earlier is that it's as if part of our being broke away from the rest and, like a disembodied satellite, wants to orbit it, constantly commenting, analyzing, criticizing, investing and divesting, fighting and welcoming, according to its peculiar damage, according to the strange damage it seems to have acquired when it first began to break away, when it first began to conflict directly with our nature as beings, animals, and humans. One way of thinking about it is that there was a kind of an accident, and I have a few narratives and stories about that I find fascinating. But we all experienced a recapitulation of this process when we were little, when we were being enlanguaged and enculturated, when we began to become concerned about being able to speak and write and use numbers, to analyze, to argue, to form opinions and beliefs. And when I speak of those things, I speak primarily of the the representational shadows of those things. And those shadows are far more thin and vulnerable than they appear. Most of our simplistic theories and ideas about nature, our minds, our emotional selves, our bodies, are, for all their seeming advancement, if we compare them to certain historical situations and contexts, they're incredibly crude, and certainly, mostly, are less than 1% true-ish. Right? We'll settle for a very low grade truth most of the time when we're depending on the cognitive and linguistic prostheses that we've developed and have become almost invisible to us. One moment. We're so used to depending on them, and there's a very complex network of authorization schemas that underlie how we use language, how we think about identity and quality and being. And some of these things are so sophisticated that it's very difficult to model them or speak intelligently about them in ordinary language. But our ideas and beliefs, our analyses and measurements depend on both purposive schemas, right? What our intentions are, why we are interested, and also authorization schemas. These can include biases, myths, truisms, tropes, colloquialisms, and so on. And many of those things are at least as primitive as the kind of confusion we imagine when we use the word superstition. We've just exchanged metaphysical superstitions for conceptual and linguistic superstitions. In the same way that we've exchanged something like the worship of gods for the worship of nations, or sports teams, or influencers, or actors and actresses, or artists. There's a lot of this kind of underhanded exchange, right? Kind of counterfeiting. We think we got rid of superstitions. No, we hid them in representations and myths and theories. Just as the insight of Darwin's evolutionary theories were hidden in the effulgence of arguments about the proper naturalness of the strongest competitors winning at all costs. Even our science is not immune to being captured and co-opted by the strange factory of disembodied thinking, quote unquote, priorities, activities, imperatives. And these are imperatives like war. In the modern milieu, there's nearly no possible justification for war. But many of our institutions are like this. War stands out as one of the primary unnecessary tragedies resulting, at least in part, from our incredible confusion that happens once we begin to form up to fight or argue. There are, of course, exceptions. But we are fighting wars, our nations, our institutions, are fighting wars of their own invention, wars that are invented just to keep the institutions hungry, entrenched, powerful, and dominant. So in a way, our own individual minds are a bit like those of our societies. They're haunted by ghosts of ideas and theories and language and so on. And most of that stuff is of such poor quality that if you could actually see what's directly available, given the assets and nature of our humanity, you'd never touch that other stuff, or only very rarely and when it was really important. We'd use it more like a very dangerous tool that we're extremely cautious of, rather than like a courtroom of authorization and ignorance masquerading as expertise. And I am subject to all these things I speak of. My own mind is thus. And I struggle, believe me, with the issues I orbit in my talks in a really deep way that's quite confusing. I mean, one would think, I would think, that if I were aware of these matters, that would help me to resolve them. But it's much more complex than that. What we've inherited is extremely sophisticated and becomes really deeply embedded in our experience of being human. Excuse me. And there are so many factors involved, not the least of which is our incredible sensitivity to context. Right? In a way, we're drafting on the accomplishments, the historical developmental accomplishments of our species in their in our capacity for representational cognition. Now, our bodies are doing the same thing genetically, but that process is trustworthy, all the way down to its roots. In fact, it really isn't, it's sort of incapable of telling a fiction, whereas our cognitive aspect is almost the opposite of that. It only tells fictions. Those fictions are carefully produced to hide some things, highlight others, emphasize others, authorize some, deauthorize others. And most of what our cognitive aspect is concerned about is control. It wants an artifact, not a relationship. A relationship is unpredictable. A relationship has to be embodied. It's deeper than language or ideas or models or theories. But the ideas and models and qualities and theories, those are manipulable. Those are like frames or tools. And our thinking aspect loves that because it feels competent there, and would argue that none of that other embodiment stuff is even really necessary. We've got everything we need right here in the framework, the idea, the opinion, the bias, the demand. Now, I'm generalizing about these things, and I'm generalizing in a way that's also fairly crude, in the sense that I'm speaking particularly about the aspects of our representational heritage that are troubling and frightening and dangerous. And they're not intrinsically thus. They have these properties primarily because of the imperatives that underlie our relationship with them and what we received, what was transmitted to us by our cultures, and moment to moment in the contexts in which we live, what is presented as good or true or appropriate, what is celebrated and what is denigrated. When the sun goes away, it's dark here, but it's light somewhere else. And perhaps this is too simple an idea to make universal, but if we think about qualities like hot or cold, black or white, immediately it becomes apparent that they're dependent on many things that aren't usually included in our thinking about them. Who is looking, why they're looking, where they're looking, when they're looking, what is the scope of their view, what is their angle of perspective on the phenomenon. And by angle of perspective, I mean, what are their concerns, presuppositions, what have they dismissed to acquire this angle of perspective, what have they included? And of course, we can't include all the things we might need to, because many of those things we're completely unaware of. And some of that awareness is hidden below the verbal conceptual levels in our bodies, and perhaps in our souls. Those faculties tend to be timid. They're aware of the strata that lies on top of them, of its dominant, forceful nature, of its capacity to dismiss, denigrate, accuse, criticize. And they're not very interested in war. This is another problem, right? The general character of the strata we inherit as human beings is extremely interested in conflict because it's interested in control and domination. And some people have associated this with patriarchy, and I don't intend to dismiss that argument, but I think there's a much deeper context than mere patriarchy. However, to whatever degree that may be a useful way of thinking about some of the problems in our social system. No, there's something much deeper. And it's hungry. And it's angry. And it feels vulnerable, but it expresses that as domination. I suppose one of the other things I was thinking about was the quality of being alive. We have in our categories, right, the categories of being, place, thing, time, so on, we have the idea of an organism. I think we're very confused about what that actually refers to, but we've made some modest, weird progress on the representational side, and that's not the best side to know what an organism is from, by the way. It's like trying to know about your girlfriend's lips with a hammer. Not a good idea, right? Or your boyfriend's lips, or anyone's lips. This is the kind of problem we face, right? The hammer produces all kinds of seemingly shiny derivations, models, analyses, criticisms. But it's a hammer. It's not alive, right? It has no skin in the game. And most of the critics and authorities in our lives and cultures are very similar. They have no skin in the game. They're not at risk. They don't have a body to be at risk. They're a weird kind of simulated life that happens in animals like us. And I wouldn't call them organisms, but they behave in populations in a way not too dissimilar from how we might imagine some organisms behaving. Not necessarily in nature, but perhaps in something more like a laboratory, where the context has been severely denuded of its natural complexity and diversity. And the strata we inherit is like the result of this experiment having gone on for millions or perhaps billions of human lifetimes. And so we have this weird problem where we acquire tools that pretend to be minds, but they are not mind-like, they are tool-like. And those tools, as we embody and express them, replace the living underpinnings, the vast depths of consciousness, awareness, and embodied existence, with something not entirely dissimilar to paved trails or roads or freeways. And what travels on those freeways is language, models, analyses, criticisms, celebration, or counterfeits of some of these things. As if there were a network that connects all human minds at all times, and there are entities that dominate that network. Now, are they alive? Well, the whole thing's a model. And even our ideas about organisms and such is a model. But what occurred to me is that there are two categories of things we don't really have classes for at all. So we have classes like object or being, right? Object or organism. Trash can's an object, even though it's probably swarming with organisms. In fact, it might be hard to find something lying around that wasn't infected with lots of organisms. And there's a question about, once something that isn't living is a swarm with organisms, is that thing then itself alive? And this question's not trivial because it applies to our planet, right? We don't think of our planet as an organism, usually. But since it's swarming with them, maybe that makes it alive. But my real concern or interest here is a little bit weirder. What if there are things that are more than merely alive? What if there are beings that aren't simply embodied, even though they may participate with embodied beings? Well, we don't have a category for that except in religion or metaphysics. There's no common category of more than alive. And in case you think it's not relevant, for most of human history, fire was about as hot as things ever got. We might encounter lava, that was hotter. But mostly fire was about as hot as it gets. We never imagined the temperatures common on the sun, right? So there's something more than mere heat. And fusion, atomic fusion, and the example of whatever's happening at the event horizon of a black hole, these demonstrate that the common qualities we presume to be concrete are matters of scope, right? So what if the scope of an organism is different from what we imagine? Suppose, for example, that the scope of my being is mostly not local to me, and that what is local to me is a peculiar concentration of the qualities inherent in that vast, constellated, layered web of non-local being and relationship, activity, motivation, inspiration, adoration, wonder. So we don't really have a class for more than a being. And although we have the class of machine, which is a weird, less than a being simulation of some very small number of the functions of a being, or what we can derive as functions of a being. The distribution of force, the transformation of matter. We don't really have a class for these aren't beings, but they compete against them and act a bit, they simulate parts of them, right? And our machines are like this. But it appears that in our cognitive dimension, there's another form of non-being that competes for dominance in the network of transports between human minds, competes for reproduction rights, and it's disembodied, it's not alive. And yet, like some kind of strange disease, it's contagious and it propagates wildly under various contexts and opportunities. And we can see this in the sphere of ideas and biases that are presently swarming around in our media. And of course we have the media itself, which is a really weird construct, fundamentally conflicted, fascinated with dominance, attention gathering, reproduction, transmission, not fascinated with excellence, not fascinated with success, fascinated with survival at all costs, pretty much at any cost. And so you can see a likeness between our own individual interiority, where we struggle with and against the bizarre artifacts we've inherited, particularly the myths, biases, wrong opinions, bad theories, bad interpretations of good theories, bad applications of useful theories, and so on. And my own mind, however I may have been able to, however far I may have been able to see into some of the roots of the trouble, is just as vulnerable. Well, maybe a little less. There are some aspects of language and modernity that I've tried to establish buffers, but mostly just absorb that stuff and reflect it back, or pay it no attention, or attend something other than that passionately. Those are some strategies that can be helpful. But even with all of that, I have the same struggle with my own mind. It's like I'm dominated by a tool in my mental experience. And the aspects of the tool that are most dominating are vulnerable. They're vulnerabilities. Right? The felt sense of danger, threat, fear, anxiety, concern about future, concern about the past. Strangely, much of the trouble that I experience, and I think many people share this, is predictive. We make some very superficial analysis of a situation, we're concerned about, and project that over the future. Usually our initial analyses are both, they have aspects of, more or less correct concern, but they also have aspects of pretending that the unknown is known. And the future is an extremely unknown kind of thing. Much more tenuous than we imagine from our experience of waking up every day and still being alive. Mostly unknown. And, there's an aspect of our cognition that's really good at detecting and responding to threats, mostly at a relatively simple level, but sometimes in a sophisticated way as well. Of course, when we feed some aspect of our awareness, like what I'll refer to as the threat sentinel, just like an institution, it wants more scope, more authority, more dominance. And this inclination can be taken advantage of in all kinds of different ways by media and our institutions. So I think there are beings that are more than merely alive, and I think we may participate with them in some way that's difficult to frame in language at the moment. But there are also entities that aren't alive, or at least it can be useful to model these processes in these ways, because they have some properties we associate with organisms. They reproduce, they acquire terrain, they spread. There are terrain predators in human cognition. Entity-like constructs that compete for dominance both of the transports between human minds and of the relationships those human minds engage in. And of course the minds themselves. The goal is to collapse the structural diversity and the precedence of the body and the unconscious and the dreaming mind, to collapse all that into manipulable artifacts, tokens, exchangeable little blips of information or resources. Strange word there. For if those were really our resources, we'd probably have a very different emotional relationship with them. A relationship more appropriate to beings capable of looking beyond and before the tokens and artifacts we largely exchange in lieu of that awareness. So if what disappears somewhere appears somewhere else, I wonder where the potential for incredible intelligence and intimacy and wonder and play, where they disappear to as they are overcome by the stifling, structured strata, layers of the representational traditions we inherit and reenact and find very confusing in our day-to-day lives as human beings. Some of those potentials remain in the body. Some of them extend into our relationships or the world, the sky. They may have extent we've never properly imagined, because most of our models are young and relatively crude. A bee just took brief shelter under my umbrella. I think we carry within us, so to speak. Or maybe it's not that we carry within us anything. Rather, we are comprised moment to moment. We are, as if an aspect of us is breathing in the place of our essence, in the place of our bodies, in the place of our emotional selves. These potentials and assets are flowing and alive, deep underground, away from protected from the structured fictions and aggressive ideas and language that we're commonly immersed in. But they emerge when it's safe. They emerge when invited and nurtured, nourished and rewarded. And so, even if they may seem to our waking mind to be gone, or have died, or have become so inhibited as to barely be sensible to us, deep within ourselves, they're thriving, hoping for an opportunity to emerge into embodiment and expression and rejuvenation of our humanity, perhaps of our world. If we can learn to understand these matters more clearly together, it will certainly be useful even in our own lives and relationships. It's not clear whether we have the capacity to change the world, or if that would be a good idea given our present relatively impoverished ideas of what we'd like. Though there are obvious changes that are absolutely crucial for our species to have made 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. We're very late to the game. One of the strange myths is that humans can outrun time, right? That we can outrun death, that we can conquer nature, conquer death, conquer disease. But it's, again, very similar to the idea of my hand trying to conquer me. My hand can't conquer its origin, and if it did, it would die. And this is the same problem with these bizarre ideas that, again, have become mind-like entities in our modern human experience. I think there are different species of mind-like entities that we're trained to compose and sustain together. And thankfully, this implies that we can develop much more beneficial versions of this kind of phenomenon, much more trustworthy versions, more humane versions, more intelligent versions, more embodied versions. And of course, in little melting pots within our culture, some cohorts play at these things constantly. To be alive is an astonishing thing. To continue to live more so. But to remember, for me, the dreams and aspirations, the suffering and struggle of all the beings who have lived on earth, to remember that. And to have a concern about fulfilling some of those dreams. To have a concern about transforming how our species develops and how we relate with the relatively science fiction-y aspects of our representational cognition. These are goals that move my heart and inspire me to continue to quest and seek passionately, hopefully, to understand the history and our present situation and the potentials inherent in our astonishing situation as human beings. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to continuing to learn and grow together very soon.